I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening to what I think is going to be a very special conversation. It's one that I've been looking forward to. But I'd also like to acknowledge that Alexis and I are speaking tonight on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Nation. Alexis is a member of the Wurundjeri Nation of the Southern Highlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Her first book was a non-fiction book and was called Grog Wars, about various battles over alcohol in Tennant Creek. Her first novel was The Plains of Promise. That was in 1997. Her novel Carpentaria won the Miles Franklin Literary Award in 2007. And her latest novel has just, the Swan Book, which we're going to talk about tonight, has just been published. She's a distinguished research fellow in the Writing Society Research Group at the University of Sydney. The Swan Book is really an extraordinary book. I don't know if you've managed to catch any of the reviews. I don't think I've ever read as many resoundingly, not just positive reviews, but reviews where people have been blown away by the originality and the uniqueness of this novel, and I'm in agreement with that assessment of the work. It's I think it'll stay with me for years to come, even though I've only probably forever. It's haunting. It is haunting, and because it's full of a lot of really complex ideas. But actually, when you're reading it, there's a beautiful simplicity to what Alexis does, which is why I've actually asked her to start by reading from the novel, so you get a sense of her language and the rhythms, and I think that's a kind of really good way to lead into talking about it, because otherwise it can end up sounding like a difficult book, and it's not. So that's Alexis, are you ready to start reading? Are you happy to launch in, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, thank you, Sophie. Thanks for everybody coming tonight, and I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we're on tonight, the Wurundjeri people, and it's really good to be here tonight talking about the Swan Book. I thought I would read a few short sections of the book, and just to give you a little bit of a taste for it, and I slipped in another little piece about the first time I've seen swans in the area. Yeah. So Sophie and I have been talking about the book by email over the last few days, and we've both just come back from Darwin. And all right, but we didn't see each other in Darwin. We didn't know.
I mean, part of I'm writing about weather and climate change, and I'm writing about Cyclone Tracy, which I've been researching, which I was thinking about a lot about my own project as I was reading yours.
All right. So I'll start with reading from page 1, and I'll just get to the right area, from the Ignis Factus, and this is the beginning of the Swan Book, from the narrator. Upstairs in my brain there lives this kind of cut snake virus in its doll's house. Little stars shining over the moonscape garden twinkle endlessly in a crisp sky. The crazy virus just sits there on the couch and keeps a good old QV out of the window for intruders. It ignores all the eviction notices stacked on the door. The virus thinks it is the only pure, full-blood virus left in the land. Everything else is just half-caste, worth nothing. Not even a property owner. Hell yes. It thinks worse than the swarm of rednecks hanging around the neighbourhood. Hard to believe a brain could get sucked into vomiting bad history over the beautiful sunburned plains. Inside the doll's house, the virus manufactures really dangerous ideas as arsenal, and if it sees a white flag unfurling, it fires missiles from a bazooka through the window into the flat space, field, or whatever else you want to call life. The really worrying thing about missile launching fenestre is what will be left standing in the end, and which splatterings of truth running around in my head about a story about a swan with a bone will be left on this ground. And I'm reading from the second chapter now, which is titled Dust Cycle. and it's talking about what's happened to the land. Could an ancient hand be responsible for this? The paper country, looking as though the continent's weather system had been rolled like an ancient scroll from its top and bottom ends, and ping sprung shut over the Tropic of Capricorn. The weather then flipped sides, swapping southern weather with that of the north, and this unique event of unrolling the climate upside down left the entire continent covered in dust. When the weather patterns began levelling out after some years, both ends of the country looked as though normal weather was being generated from the previously dry centre of Australia. When the heart of the country locked into this tempestuous affair, hot and sticky, what was once the south's cold temperate climate mixed with the north's tropical humidity until the whole country was shrouded in days of dust. Junda, or all the time in heavy cyclonic rain. And let's go.
I should say that the novel is set about 100 years in the future, for those of you who haven't read it, and it's climate change has taken, really got its hooks into the nation and indeed the whole world. Mm-hmm. And also the intervention is still in operation. And
just going back a bit, I should have read this first, but anyway, it doesn't make any difference. I think it'll be all right. Then an elder, I'm talking about these times, which I call Halcyon times, for the lake people. This is around a lake where a lot of Aboriginal people had been trucked from other places because of the intervention ideas are still in place, and people are put in these areas. And there's sandstorms pouring over the lake, and it turns the lake into a swamp. And then an elder, a healer for the country, arrived to examine the devastation, which he called a total ugly bitch of an annihilation. He turned up like a boogeyman, a Karawala, Dundaba, Bari, Nunno, Yulwa, Kudola. He claimed that he was feeling pain in his heavy heart, turned up from nowhere like an aeroplane, Balakundi, Nulu, and he flies when he wants to. His name is the Harbour Master. And this little then about the first swans that come in the area with this change weather patterns. And this is the main character, Oblivion Etheline. Oblivia remembered thinking that dust had a way of displacing destiny the first time she saw a swan. A red ghost was rolling in the sky when a lone, grey-black swan suddenly appeared at lunchtime over the riparian rook of this northern world. General swan people sitting round as slack as you please were shoveling freshly sautéed fish fillets into their mouths when they heard the strange song of the swan. The whole place was silent. Nobody said a word. Everyone stopped eating. Half-raised forks froze midstream above the dinner plates. The dinner went cold while everybody stared at the first swan ever seen on this country. Only their thoughts, wild with noise, were asking why this strange bird stilted the heat of the day with song where there had been no song for swans. The local asked the storming almighty red dust spirit relation, "What's that, bro?" And I thought I would read a lighter piece from the book by a special monkey in this novel, a monkey called Rigoletto.
The monkey's pretty crazy.
Any little monkey could rattle off a litany of worse things happening in its world, but Rigoletto sat with steely red face on the dragon and thought very seriously about prescribed responsibility as the worst kind of thing that could have happened to him. It was the only problem he had with being a pet monkey. He knew that he was supposed to step in like a man instead of just being a monkey and become the girl's guardian if the harbour master was not around, although very clearly he recognised that the act of guardianship over others did not come naturally to him. He hated being trained to act responsibly. There was nothing in it. He was not the harbour master's pet monkey by any stretch of the imagination. It was moments like these where a few guilty pangs forced Rigoletto to forget he was supposed to be a pet by acting like a wild animal. A wild animal was not supposed to look after people. It was supposed to be the other way around. Where was the beauty in a monkey worrying about people? His brain bolted from the reality of floating around a flooded city street on a magnificent but ruined dragon. His idea of beauty lay tens of thousands of kilometres away, where long-necked swans foraged for insects in muddy rice fields with the swallows in a world that enjoyed listening to exquisite plum blossom music being played on a bamboo flute. He held this thought. He hummed through bubble gum sticking between his clicking teeth. It did not lose any sense of the flute's musicality in his own rendition of the plum and cherry blossom music that he had locked in his head. And I might leave it there.
Okay.
Although I might just read this last little bit.
Yeah.
He's worried about the harbour master. Where are you, harbour master? You got to come back. Rigoletto's experience of global warming was academic, not practical. He remained on guard while Olivia continued to be dragged along with the dragon through the water, knowing that very soon she would be found. She was part of the most important story happening in the world right now. There could be no other way for the girl wife if she survived, because he was worried about being in the dragon in the middle of some common big storm of climate change, rising sea level event, which was, he thought was nothing to worry about because he'd been in flooded seaboard cities.
He'd been living in
many
Bangkok,
places, in streets of Venice and in Pakistan and Bangladesh.
I do actually want to talk to you about animals in the book. I mean, swans, obviously, but animals drive the narrative as much as people. There's kind of a slippage, really, between human and animal figures. But first, maybe to set this, one of the extraordinary things I think about the novel is certainly the way you get reviewed and people might talk about your work is the use of an Indigenous voice in Australian literature. But in fact, what you do in this, it's actually more about the Indigenous voice within the world. I mean, it's very much a global novel.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I wanted it to be a novel that was to do with universal concerns that affect people, across the world, things that people are worried about the world over, and people are worried about. The common people, the normal people, and the people on the ground are worried about climate change, and climate change is affecting people. People who have got that close connection to the land are noticing things that are not right. Things are changed, and so I wanted to set the book in the future to say if if this is the best we can do right now, what might it look like in, say, 80 years' time? And
more reports came out today suggesting that your fairly apocalyptic vision wasn't inaccurate. It was, I don't know if people heard. There's more bad news every day, and I'm not going to detail it all.
No,
but certainly
you're not
exaggerating. Particularly that you. In an essay you wrote in 2011, you talked about a lot of things. You talked about the fact, you asked why we're not hearing about any of these stories and trying to understand what they mean, those stories being stories of climate change from within the Indigenous community. Are they stories that and then you talk about the Guru cycle, which is grew out of Cyclone Tracy as an example of telling a story about the weather, and Rover Thomas's paintings that came out of. Did you decide to write a novel about the weather? What was kind of
look,
or about swans, or both?
This novel, I started to think about this novel in say 2002, 2003, when I was still living in Central Australia, and after I'd finished Carpentaria and got over finishing that novel, and I was thinking about to write a new novel, and the Swans came first. I don't know how I didn't take notes. I take a lot of notes, but I wanted to write a book about swans, and I had no idea about swans at that stage. I lived most of my life in Northern Australia, and we don't. And where I come from in northwest Queensland and the Gulf of Carpentaria, where my family came from, we don't have swans up there, and so it wasn't a bird that I knew anything about. But I do know a lot about swans now.
What was it about swans? I mean, how did this come to you?
Well, look, you put John Howard on one hand and a swan on another. What would you rather? Would you rather know?
I personally would hang out with the swan, but
and so. And it was at a time where
you used the word to me in an email. You said that they represent decent. Did you use the word decency, or kind of
sort of search for decency?
Yeah.
And that's what it became. I did a lot of research on swans, black swans in Australia, and swans throughout the world, and finding about. Swan species, there's 8 swan species in the world, and some migrate over long distances, ours don't, and not normally. And also I looked at a lot of poetry, swan poetry, and
the poetry of Seamus
Heaney.
You talked about when he died recently. I read articles.
Yeah. No. I never met Seamus Heaney, but he was a very important person to me. I did a lot of my writing in Central Australia and northern parts of the country, and up until I moved down here. And when I first started writing, it was quite a lonely journey. It is anyway a lonely occupation, and but when you're in Northern Australia at that particular time, I didn't have many people that I felt I could turn to and get some guidance from. Where I've had a lot of guidance from my own people in the Indigenous world about all kinds of things. I'm used to having guidance, and but not so much in the writing. And so in Central Australia in particular, I look to other people, the people that I could learn things from, and Seamus Heaney was that sort of person. Through his poetry, I felt I could learn, something about what he represented, what he tried to do, how he tried to write about Ireland and the troubles of Ireland. We have troubles here, and how he felt about just normal things. And
so it was more than his poetry. He as a person kind of became like a guiding figure.
Yeah, I loved his poetry, and I loved some of the Irish writers as well.
Yeats is obviously
Yeats and James Joyce, and people like that. So I always felt he was really important, and plus he was alive. And at that stage, I always thought, oh, wouldn't it be great one day to meet Seamus Heaney? But I never got to meet him. I did go to Ireland, to Dublin, and a few years ago, and not many people can get to meet someone like him, and everybody wants to knock on his door, and so but.
He probably wouldn't have minded if you'd knocked on his door, I suspect.
I don't know. And but at the airport, at the airport in Dublin, they have these big banners, huge banners on the wall of his poetry all around the airport. And I saw one and I read it, and I do know the poem from before, and there was postscript, and it was. I felt I didn't get a chance to meet him, but it was like he'd give me a message. If you want to see swans in Ireland, you should go to County Clare, to the flaggy shores of County Clare. So I always remembered that. And
did you
so
go?
I did read the poem at the Writers' Festival. No, I didn't have enough time, but definitely if I get back to Ireland one day, I will go there.
And you even talk about the first sighting of Europeans' first sighting of swans in Australia, in West Australia.
Yeah, in Western Australia.
In the 1600s or...
Yes, that's right. Because it was before that, it was believed that, the black swans never existed, and that was the first sighting, and, that sighting anyway, in the 1600s, and that sort of broke that myth that there was only white swans in the world. And in fact, black swans were seen as a bad sign. That it was thought of as a bad thing, black swans. But then they saw them and it broke the myth.
One of the things about the swans, about every creature is a refugee of, almost everyone is a refugee of a sort, and is displaced. So you have monkeys from Bangkok and swans from other places, and there's Belladonna, who has come from somewhere in Eastern Europe, you assume,
yes,
who tells the stories of swans. And while there's a very clear relationship to Indigenous ways of storytelling, I also got a very strong sense of European fairy tale.
Yes, well, I looked at all those things when I was doing research for the book, and the Calavera, the epic, story, and it's Finnish, I think, is it? Calavera, and
sure.
And they talk about swans in there, and there's some beautiful poetry from right across the world, and because after Carpentaria won prizes, people wanted me to go lots of places, not only around the country to talk about the book, but also many countries overseas. I couldn't keep up with it in the end, but I did go to places like China and India, and places I went, I learned things about swans, and I was in India. Learned about the swan raga, because I took an interest in classical Indian music. People giving me...
You're doing work in India, aren't you, at the moment, or have you been?
No.
All right, okay.
No, I didn't go on that trip.
Right.
Yes, I've been cancelling a lot of trips.
Right.
Or saying, no, I can't do a lot of trips overseas at the moment because I wanted to get the Swan Book out, and there's work to do here with the book, and plus other projects I'm working on. So
that does actually lead me to a question I had when I was reading this. I was really blown away by it, partly as a writer myself. I was trying to imagine what it would be like to hold yourself in the place where you could write this novel for years on end. So I did want to ask you how long it took to write, and how you managed to... It's such an intense... It's almost like allowing yourself to be anchored into a dream for years on end. It must have been very difficult.
At times, yes, it was really difficult to write this book, and to keep at it, to keep the thread going. And particularly when there's a lot of other calls on your life, and and the work that you have to do, and also the work that I was doing for the Carpentaria, and doing a lot of travelling. It's really hard to hold. You really do have to hold the book and the ideas and keep the threads going. And there's lots of threads in that book, and so. What was happening, or I would come back, because if you say yes, I will go, overseas and do these events and things. Well, as soon as you say yes, that's when the work starts. They want you to do this and they do that, and they want this information and what flights and where you want to go and how long you're going to stay there and what will you talk about and will you write this paper and will you go along here
and all that interrupts your imaginative space.
And then you do learn a lot from doing those sort of things. But you come back and you look at the manuscript and you say, what was I thinking? And you start again and you and you try to get the thread going again, and the feel in your mind, and you keep going until the next thing that you've said that you do comes up, and you go through that whole cycle again, and which will go for it takes about a couple of months really to get yourself back in that process. But I'm quite amazed, because when the ideas I first had the ideas long time ago in 2002, 2003, I started writing up notes of ideas for this novel, what I wanted in there, and that I wanted to have the book set in the future. And I can look back at that now, and it's probably about 10 pages of notes, and single line, and to see at the end that the book is out, that it became a book, is quite a miracle, really. I think it really is a miracle. When you start at that base of taking these notes around with you and saying this is the thread of this book. So yeah, it's a long journey, and it really is hard to keep the threads going for a long period of time. What point did
Olivia, the main character, the main human character, come into it for you? Because she was, I related to her as I was reading it, in that there's a kind of, she's mute, she has a very active imagination, and we get an insight into that with language, but she doesn't say words. And there's something, her silence in the face of the kind of the world's destruction, and a rage as well. It's not just passivity. There's a real anger there at what's happening. Where did Olivia come from? Is she sort of the part of you that feels those kind of aspects of rage about what's happening?
No, I don't think Olivia is me. I hope not.
Well, I didn't mean simply you, but there's just emotionally, she's a very. There's a kind of restrained frustration and rage that carries her.
If anything, you can look at it in a lot of ways, and I'm sure as years to come that there'll be many people writing about the book. The academics write about the Carpentaria. They still write about Carpentaria in all different ways, and people see all different things in it, and you can explain it in many, many different ways. But Oblivia, you can look at it in one way. The rage in the Aboriginal world, the silence that came out of that Howard years, and then leading into the intervention and the continuation and reinforcement of the intervention, and there's the silence that came, initially, from the Indigenous world, where you got only a few people actually commenting on Aboriginal issues,
and no one was, and there was no consultation.
No consultation, and there was this silence and a rage, a burning rage that was there, but no one. And there was this whole and through the media, this whole damning of Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal men, Aboriginal failure, to do anything, and by a lot of people who really would know, and what was happening, how people worked hard, how people were ignored, about the kind of things that they, were working towards them. I mean, and I know, I know from some of the work that I did in Central Australia for very senior men and women from all the language groups across Central Australia. They formed a group called the Combined Aboriginal Nations of Central Australia, and they had led to the Kalkaringi Convention, where they tossed out the ideas for the Northern Territory to become a state unless it had a modern constitution that really included Aboriginal rights, and the kind of things that they were looking at, ideas of Aboriginal government. It was all ignored. I mean, and these were people who really cared about their children and cared about the future, and wanted to plan and be, have some control about the sort of future that they wanted to work towards. You can't impose a future on people; they got to be part of it. And so there was that. So, if anything,
that's the rage.
That's the rage.
And one of the people that does the ignoring and doesn't listen to Aboriginal voices in the book is indeed an Aboriginal man himself, is Warren Finch. I almost daren't ask where he might have come from. And I had little flashes of Noel Pearson. I don't know if that was intended or... But I suppose what it led me to wonder was whether... You're raising the question about whether you can you need to be outside the system to fight it, because certainly Warren Finch has been so assimilated into ideas of respectability and being a political Aboriginal that he loses any kind of place in the world, his place in the world, or doesn't really know how to define himself anymore.
Well, with the Warren Finch character, his character is part of that idea of putting the novel in the future, and saying if this is what is happening now, and it continues to happen this way, what might the world look, our world look like in the future, in some decades to come, and I tied that into. These are universal concerns, for the whole world. We've got some issues that are not being
Warren Finch actually is the first Indigenous Prime Minister of Australia, so I should have said that one.
When I started thinking about this novel in 2002, 2003, there was no intervention then.
So had you imagined...
in my notes, I was already imagining an Aboriginal world that was controlled by the army,
right?
And it happened. That happened through the intervention, and so the question became very quite a burning question is. And I think is something that that's not looked at properly when people define and develop quick answers and about what should happen in the Indigenous world, intervention, closing the gap, whatever, and but they don't look at the total. A very complicated picture of what's happening, and that these things have to be really sorted out by people on the ground themselves. And but if you keep going this way, how might it look in the future? That's what I was looking at, and looking at the way things are seen now, and who gets heard and who doesn't, and
what you have to do to get heard,
yeah,
the kind of
and
compromises you have
and
to
what
make.
you do to get acceptance, and so if you develop those sort of characters and those sort of ideas and that sort of those sort of policies, and you carry that in the future, well, what might it look like? And that's what I was trying to do with a character like Warren Finch. I mean, we already have, and it's not very far off. These ideas were worked out before we had a black president in the United States, and that came along through the process of writing this novel. And we got an Aboriginal Chief Minister now of the Northern Territory. But
it doesn't fix things. It doesn't necessarily fix things,
No,
it
doesn't necessarily fix things at all. But if you carry on with the same process of that sort of government system that, particularly in the territory, which doesn't suit the whole of the population. If you carry on with, you continue that sort of system and you ignore some of the realities of failure, you carry that failure into the future. And on those terms, this is what you might get.
Can you talk to us a little bit about animals in your life and how that comes through in the book, that they're sort of as they have as much kind of authority in the book as human characters, and what is your relationship with animals and how does that play out in this novel?
I've always liked animals, and since I was a child, but also in the Indigenous world, everything is sacred, and animals are sacred, and have stories, and with the swans, they're sacred to people, and I talked to people along the Coorong who talked about the damage that had been done to the Coorong and how they used to have thousands of swans along there, but they're not there now. Where the swans gone, and that's they had a place there. And if swans then starting to appear in other places like Central Australia, people were telling me a lot of stories about swans. They'd see in Central Australia at the Suruj Pond, there might be swans, a few swans there, or seeing swans out in right out bush on some very shallow, a sheet of water after rain. They might see, a couple of swans and be really surprised
where they didn't used to be.
No.
So that is really happening. That swans are moving.
Yes, well, there was more swans around Alice Springs, and for instance, and people were ringing me up and say, there's all these swans were flying up the Todd River today, and we saw, made a little dedication to the 15 or 16 swans heading north, up Larapinta Drive. So what are they doing there? And
so have people in the various communities you've worked in over the years...
And they haven't got no story.
Been talking about ways and about climate change, even though they mightn't have used that kind of language about it, about these kind of shifts and...
No, well, yes and no. I mean, it's... people will talk about in Central Australia, for instance, about the changing weather patterns and having more rain, and there was a big cycle of a lot of rain, and the climate almost becoming like Darwin, very hot and humid, and that was different, and people on and on the coast and some other islands, they
on
concerns
Torres Straits,
them.
obviously.
In Torres Straits, that's right. So it's an issue for people, I think, everywhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, I haven't had that deep conversation with a lot of people, but people do talk about things about cyclones and cyclones can come and grab you and
well, they have a meaning. They're seen to be a warning of well, certainly Cyclone Tracy was seen to be a warning about. And you, in Carpentaria, you write a lot about cyclone and what it
and
can
I wrote
mean.
about Cyclone Yassi, reaching right into inland Queensland, right? Which reached across to the Northern Territory. That was really strange. People thought that was very odd. But then there's stories about cyclones can come and chase you, no matter where you are, and so that's quite scary too.
So that they feel quite personal, that people feel that they're kind of being punished for.
Well, that's right. People would question that.
We've got some time for questions. There's the one there.
I was reading today that there was an article recently by David Mann about refugees, where he said that there's a tendency for people in refugee, when talking about refugees, to say, this is the way to fix it, and it's you can do this, and it'll be okay. And I was struck by just the similarity with what you were saying just then about Aboriginal policy, and I was wondering whether you see parallels in the way that people make political capital, I suppose, out of people arriving on boats to this country, and the sorts of things that are happening with Indigenous Australia.
Well, my countryman, Marandu Yena, says that, what are they talking about? They're all boat people, they're all boat people here, and they're all welcome, and something like that anyway, on those lines. I think this country has got a history of wanting to lock people up, and feeling that that's the way you have to deal with what you don't like, or the outsider, or people of difference, that you have to lock it up or keep it safe, and we've had a lot of experience in Australia in doing that. We had reserves for Aboriginal people for years, where people were locked up. There's a whole history of it. If you look at the history of Aboriginal people and reserves and missions in Queensland, and then the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advancement Act, or whatever legislation, whatever it was, where people were controlled. Well, their whole life it was control. It was control of who can come, who could go, and families were split up, and you had to get permission to marry, and your home could be inspected any time. Your children could be put in the dormitory, and you're right. They got away with it. The Australian government's got away with it, and so they've had plenty of practice, so they know how to do it.
And you're actually right about how the passivity that gets sort of forced upon people if they're kind of being treated in this way, and the way it erodes culture, which is obviously, I think, has implications for refugee communities who are being locked up as well. And
that's why I had this character, Belladonna, in the book, and because I thought, well, where's the sense of decency in all this, and we are capable of being decent, and being good. If you look at the poetry of the world, just in terms of a swan, and and you see all these beautiful thoughts and sentiments, and they come from people, from all over the world, and it's celebrated. So we are capable of being good, and but I thought, what we're doing here is so wrong and so mean and nasty, and so Belladonna is a representation that, the heritage of the world of where a lot of these decision makers come from, and it's saying, you know, this can happen to you. I mentioned this before in Italo Calvino's really fantastic essays on 6 memos for the new millennium, and in one there he talks about Bogus saying, you know, there's men in the sky and on the sea and on the land, and what happens to them happens to me, and that's so true. You treat people how you want to be treated yourself, because you never know what's coming around the corner, and we're getting a lot of scientific information telling us what might be coming around the corner, so we better look out.
Even though, as you towards the end, you have is it minor birds remembering the lost language of English, and one of the phrases the birds remember is people saying "not true, not true." I found that very kind of, which is, so we're being told, but people are being quite good at saying "not true." Is there another question? There's.
Hi, the book begins and ends speaking about the virus and in Oblivia's head, and I'd just love to hear you speak about what that represents specifically for you in the novel with that character.
With Oblivia, when she's quite a damaged character, and she feels that she doesn't have control about what's happening in her world, and there's also that idea of being locked up, and the virus is got locked up in her brain. This character, you know, the virus, and who is controlling her thoughts, and she's trying to get it out by all sorts of ideas about how to get rid of it and get back control of your own mind, and which is something else is you know, I talked about before, and which is, I think, is laced through Carpentaria in this book, is the idea, which in the Indigenous world, of having sovereignty over your own mind, and even if you can't have sovereignty over the land and that control over your life, and through all sorts of things that get imposed in your world, that the only way to stay strong really is to have control over your own mind. And with the character Oblivia, that's not happening. She's having a struggle there to gain control over her own mind. She's got something else happening there, and that's the part of the world she lives in.
Yeah, you actually used that phrase, didn't you, when you gave an Udru New Knuckle lecture in 2008. You talked about the if you could succeed in keeping the basic architecture of how you think, then you own the freedom of your mind. And yeah,
I think I was writing the Swan Book at the same time.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Well, you talked about playing with ideas in 2003, but tell me a bit more about how long it actually took you to write. Were you writing continually over that period of time, or because you're working on another project at the moment, another book?
Yes, I'm working on another book now. No, with the Swan Book, it was a process of coming and going back to it over a long period of time because of other commitments, but always trying to get back to finishing it, and it took a long time to finish.
So what's the project you're working on at the moment?
I'm working on with Trackett Tilmouth, who's an Aboriginal leader in the Northern Territory, who is also a resource scientist, to developing his essayed memoir, and which is really Tracker's take on the world on so many issues that are of deep concern to him. And so that should be a good book, because Tracker is a person who has enormous ideas and understanding, and but he's also a very funny person too. He can be quite confronting in his humour when he applies it to people, and he has done to people from the top of the country, down to people in communities, and so it's a book to look forward to. It's going to be.
And are you acting like a ghost writer? Because you talk a lot about ghosts in.
Well, something like that, because he's just not going to write it himself. He's capable of writing it himself, but he's not. He's not going to sit down for 2 minutes and apply himself to writing his own book. And no, there's already a lot of advanced orders of people who want to make sure they have a look at the book to see what he might say about them. And
is it a relief to be working on a project that's sort of more external, that the ideas are being generated by someone else?
It's good fun. It's good fun, and there's also a lot of people putting their hand up who want to review the book, and so that's good. And I'm also writing another novel, so I thought I have to keep my own work going as well in terms of producing another book, and so quite a way down the track with that. And I wanted to make sure I was a fair way down the track with the new novel before the Swan Book came out, because I wasn't sure what would happen to the Swan Book when it came out. It could have gone either way. It's been really lovely that people have, a lot of reviewers have embraced it and saw the good side of the book and thought about how to describe the good side of the good of the book, where they could have rubbished it and said, no, this is all too much.
Well, one of the because I'm having used the word bleak earlier, I also would want to kind of emphasise that one of the amazing things, it's also about resilience. And Oblivia, for all her virus, which all her sort of madness, if you like, is also a real survivor. If it's her, you never quite know if she's alive or a kind of just a spirit moving across the land, but in a way it's not relevant. The point is that she endures.
No, she endures, and it's a book about endurance, but it's also a very much a book about what might the world look like, and what might our situation look like in time to come, in the future, not so distant future, and that's where it began, and that's where it finishes, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And Alexis is also available for signing, so if you can always ask her more questions or speak to her if you line up and buy a book. But I would like to thank Alexis very much for tonight's conversation.